Hello and welcome to That Thing I Did for a Year, a podcast where we interview fourth-year University of Toronto students about experiences they had in a year away from school. My name is Ilya. I'm a fourth-year industrial engineering student here at the University of Toronto, and today I'll be talking to Arkady. Arkady is a fourth-year engineering science student and happens to be the mastermind behind the operation. So, Arkady, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Arkady. I am a fourth-year engineering science student majoring in robotics. I did my PY at Google, Rapyuta Robotics, and Shopify in that order for 4 months, 8 months, and 4 months.
Sweet. So before we get into this smorgasbord of a PY you have, why did you decide to go into engineering science?
So I was I think the similar reasons apply for many people in engineering science, which is just kind of like the standard high school overachiever kind of thing. And I was pretty indecisive. I was thinking it would be nice to punt the decision about what to do with my future to end of second year instead of end of grade 12. But when I went into engineering science, I definitely wasn't totally certain which option I would want to go into, and I was there really to explore.
Just by getting to do a lot of everything. So had you had experience with programming or with computers, which is what you did over a lot of your PUI before you came into university?
Yeah, I would say a little bit. So not really through high school directly. I never took computer science class at high school. I don't even know if it was offered or not at my high school. But I guess both my parents are software engineers. My mom in grade 11 for me introduced me to this thing called MITx, which would in turn become edX, which also around the same time that Coursera was getting really big, and it was really, really exciting time in online education that I think.
Right. So these are online course platforms.
Yeah, online course platforms, and my mom showed me a few courses from first year MIT Intro to Computer Science, and she was like, "Want to watch these together?" She already knew all this stuff, but she was like, "Yeah, let's. I'll sit with you, help you with assignments and stuff, and do it." It took a few tries. She had to do a little bit of pushing, but eventually at some point I got into it myself, and that was what I started sort of looking for work in high school summers. I'd done a little bit, I worked in a lab in a bioinformatics lab at U of T in the summer between grade 11 and 12 and the summer after grade 12. And through that I got some basic programming experience, but now looking back, it was really just a chance to play around with stuff. I don't think I necessarily really developed some skills that I took for it. I think a lot of that just came from online classes, side projects on my own. And when I came into first year and was already taking the first year computer science class, I felt like I sort of knew a lot of that stuff already just from my own side work.
Just from online classes and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yeah. You got into doing some pretty heavy duty programming. I know you might laugh at that, but some pretty heavy duty programming early on, and it ended up leading to some work for you.
Yeah. So in first year, I guess I was at that time, probably more so than now, I was doing it a lot as just a hobby thing, and I would be going it wasn't at that point, but throughout first year I discovered hackathons and all these programming competitions and started going to a lot of those. But in particular, there was one in the first month of first year that I entered into with another classmate of mine called the Orbis Challenge, which is this AI programming competition. I figured I didn't really know much about that really, but it was just I'd seen a few posters, and I didn't really have any excuse not to do those things. And I think so I entered in that, and we ended up winning. And that kind of led to my first summer job, which was at Orbis. It kind of got me to an interview at least, and I had to do a bunch of interviews after that, 4 or something. But it directly was helpful in getting there. Yeah.
What was the nature of the challenge?
So it's actually a pretty fun challenge. They change it every year a bit, but it's just they take some different game. year to year. So it's something roughly like sort of 1 year was something sort of like Pong, I think. Another year was something like ours was kind of like the game Tron, the like light bike thing, where you're trying to, not hit your own tail and not hit your opponent's tail, but like box in your opponent on like a 2D grid. And your task is in like teams of 1 or 2 to code up some AI that will be able to, and then they just like throw them all in a ring kind of, and like
you're making an AI that wins a game.
Yeah, and they change the game every year. As far as I know, it still goes on. They're on like the 10th one now. And so then, so that led to my first summer job, which was working on the actual next Orbis Challenge website, which was like, this is my first time working in a more sort of professional corporate environment, still doing like software engineering work. And I found that I enjoyed it enough that I like wanted to keep pursuing that. I was at that time still trying to like reconcile how that fit in with engineering science and how I could make that fit in.
Just in terms of what you were studying over the course of your first 2 years?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of both how can my courses that I'm taking be useful to me, and also how can the work that I'm doing be useful in school. And there was some disconnect there. It was hard to really, where I feel like if I were in computer science, I would have like directly been like, like I'm doing stuff that I learned in class. Like that was with coworkers of mine that I was working with who were other U of T students who were all in computer science. They were all like, like I know this stuff from school. Like, where do you know this stuff from?
You're like MIT online.
Yeah. So I think I was struggling a little bit to like find some direct connection there between like whatever, like Calc 3 and like fluid mechanics on the one hand and like web development on the other.
Right.
But I was, in my mind at that point, it was just like, whatever, this is my first summer job, I'll take what I can get.
And, I mean, for the record, I was working security, and that connected not at all with mechanics.
Exactly. And so I felt like it was still a good opportunity, and like better than what I would have otherwise. Like that's already a pretty high thing to be really, really like aiming for, especially right from first year, is like trying to get something that directly is like what you're trying to be working in.
Did that impetus of trying to connect work with what you were studying in class change any of what you were looking for in second year, or any of what you were taking part in outside of school in second year?
A little bit. I mean, I think second year was a lot of like, second year in EngSci in general is like the big year where you choose your major, right? And and I spent a lot of, I don't remember exactly at what point in the year that occurs, but like you should be sort of thinking about it all throughout the year and thinking it's not too late to switch even like first week of third year, but you kind of like put in some decision around middle of second semester, and in first year it's on your mind a lot, and it's like you talk to people about it and you ask, hey, what option are you thinking of going into, and discuss these things. And I was very much, second year was for me just like a lot of attending these seminar talks, trying to figure out which one maybe is closest to work that I've done up to this point that I kind of enjoy.
Which was at this point mostly software development work.
Right. Yeah.
So it seems to me, just from what I know of EngSci, that ECE, so like the electrical computer engineering option in EngSci, would be closest to programming. Like, was that not like a natural jump out for you?
To be honest, not really, because if you look, it's true when you look at what people, at least like people who graduate from EngSci, what do they end up working in? It's definitely, I think, the highest proportion of the people who are in EC end up working in like tech jobs,
right?
Compared to other options. Tech being
tech
like
in air quotes,
hard, in strong air quotes that like I don't know what that word means anymore, but in software jobs, I should say. But I don't know, a lot of the courses that they take as well, I think we got to like try some sort of ECE like courses in second year, and even in robotics we had some ECE type of courses like signal processing analysis. And looking at their timetables and stuff they do, I didn't feel like that necessarily would be so useful either. That's a lot of it is more low level electrical engineering type stuff that I think is useful and good to understand, but it was deeper than I was interested to go into, like circuits and signals and stuff that I also didn't feel like that's necessarily what I needed for for the work that I wanted to do.
So why did you end up settling on robotics, or like how did that decision come about?
Right. So it was hard. I think some of the courses that I was seeing at the time, like Intro to AI, Intro to Machine Learning, a few of those, I felt like from those I would be getting the bit of programming stuff that I could, more so than I would in other options. And it kind of came down to like maybe finance, robo, or EC.
Okay.
And I think out of those, the one that jumped out as like where I would get to do the kind of programming that I was into, machine learning, AI, whatever, because it was 2016 and that was like
very, very hot.
That was the thing to do. Yeah. Not that it isn't anymore necessarily, but at that time it was really like, that's what I think.
New and buzzing, and Jerry Hinton was at U of T.
Yeah, exactly. It was an exciting time, and like, so I saw those courses and kind of gravitated towards those, and that was the main thing that drew me in. But like, otherwise, and also the math I was kind of interested in too. I was like, robots are pretty cool. I could see that as a future. I would want to get some experience in that industry and see what that kind of is like.
Mm-hmm. So I see that decision-making process, and you made the decision in second year, yeah?
Yeah.
So, nevertheless, you ended up working in software after second year.
That's right.
How did that happen, and like, what did you end up doing?
Yeah, so I guess through first semester of second year, I was like applying for mostly software jobs. I threw out applications to like every big internet company you can think of. I didn't hear back for most, but I did, I think one of the only interviews I got was with Google, and I ended up getting a summer internship there after second year. But this stuff I applied, like, I don't know where else I would have really, if I was more interested in the stuff directly relating to what I was doing in class, I don't know what path that would have necessarily led me. Maybe towards something more like kind of research-y. And I honestly just didn't feel like that was what I wanted to do. Like, I had gotten some little taste of that when I was working at the bioinformatics lab, and like, it was just, it felt a lot less exciting to me than software engineering. For sure, a big part of that was like seeing how my parents were doing it, and like, it was just seeing how that would look like, what that would look like, I think, and friends of mine as well. My sister is also studying computer science, and other people, friends of hers that I know studying computer science. All of these people that I knew, it felt like that was the way, the like most exciting way forward for me.
That makes sense. Where was the Google job, and like, what was it like?
So it was in San Francisco, in the city of San Francisco itself, as opposed to in Mountain View, which is like where the headquarters of Google are. That distance is like an hour and a half or so, where a lot of people do live in San Francisco and commute to Mountain View, but it's a very different feel in the city itself. So it was interesting. It was definitely like, I think the first 2-3 weeks I didn't write a single line of code there. It was like a little intimidating. You really just like, I would go home and be like super tired at the end of those days, even if I was working whatever, like 10 to 5 or 10 to 6 or something. Like, not a crazy long day, but just like the whole day would be spent reading code and trying to understand it, and like reading this big thing, bigger than anything I had ever worked on, even on a smaller project within Google. It's like everything is just so big, and so like, it's very mature code, very like been around for a while. A lot of smart people have worked on it for quite a while.
It's not like the thing that you would just like hack together and be like, here it is. You're like, oh, I need to be really good now. I need to understand what these other really smart people did.
It really did feel like it was, on another level. And that was my first, because what I was working on at Orbis in that first summer, it was like my own sort of thing. It was like, I did do my best to sort of try to make it clean and corporate and all, follow best practices and everything. But it was the whole like code base that we were working on was like, we started from scratch, and it was between me and another computer science student. We wrote basically all of it, that like stuff for the Orbis Challenge website. And so so it was really at Google that summer was like understanding how it works in a larger setting. And I think that was a really interesting step to have gotten to take, because I think it let me understand what that looks like in a larger setting.
was San Francisco what you expected it to be?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to think back to what my expectations were at this point. Going back to that time, I think like how I kind of characterize that experience of being there is just like getting a chance to meet a lot of people who are also in a similar position. Like I met dozens and dozens of other interns from like mostly between like Georgia Tech and the Midwest, but because those are just big sources of where tech employees come to Silicon Valley from. But meeting a lot of students at similar kind of points, also kind of doing similar things. That was the time though I also was sort of increasingly feeling some disconnect between like these people, all of whom are studying something like computer science, and me, who like all of this stuff, like I'm able to sort of keep up with them, but none of what I'm doing in class really is coming up at all. Like it was at that point I was starting to sort of abandon that hope a little bit more of like, how do I directly apply what I'm learning in school to this?
Gotcha. So you finish up at Google in second year, you get back and you start doing Robo.
Mm-hmm.
And also around this time, people start applying like for PY. What was your thought process on whether or not to do PY?
Yeah, I was thinking I wanted to find something good. I wanted to do it if I could find something good. I spent a little bit of time looking at the portal. I was originally considering doing like, if I could, a PY thing at Google, but they at the time, I don't know if this has changed since, but they at the time were not necessarily open to it. They were like, only in exceptional cases would we try to accommodate someone doing something for like 6 months, and longer than that we couldn't really do because most schools in America don't have an equivalent sort of thing.
Right.
So I found the kind of like my usual sources of looking for jobs, that being like going on whatever website I frequent and clicking the careers button. Didn't really work for finding something for a year. So I turned to the portal. I was seeing the main things of those that I was interested in was maybe if I could try some robotics job, because then I could see perhaps does this like sort of adjacent thing that I'm still should be qualified to do, this is like what I learn and so on. If I could do that, and it would be closer, and I would be getting that feeling potentially, which is what I thought I was kind of craving, which was directly applying stuff that I'm doing in coursework.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So you were starting to look for stuff where you would maybe be able to apply like that robotics thing.
Mm-hmm.
What did you end up finding?
Yeah, to that end, I ended up working at Rapyuta Robotics. That's a robotics startup that was working on trying to build a cloud robotics platform. The general idea being like abstract away all of the different differences in between all different robots and make it so that they could communicate with one another, work together effectively, and like the goal being large scale robotic systems that are currently lacking, like fully automated factory floor warehouse, etc. That's kind of the next step that a lot of people want to see in robotics, but there's sort of like a bit of a gap in implementation right now there.
So it's making the technological kind of base for different robots to be able to interact together, and for us to be able to make larger scale robot systems instead of individual robots.
Yeah.
Okay, kind of. It's a cool vision of the future.
Yeah.
Before we get into kind of like Rapyuta, you started working there in September.
In September, yeah.
So you spent the first summer of your PY again at Google.
That's right. So
yeah, how did that decision come about? And yeah.
So I guess it was kind of it felt pretty separate of a decision to be making, as in that second internship at Google could or could not have been part of a PY. It was a summer thing, and I had already secured that before I had decided whether or not I would be going on PY. Everything that I was looking for PY was like within the constraints of I could do it from September to September maybe instead. Because that first summer, like I'd gotten a return offer after the first internship and was potentially able to go back, and I was hoping maybe through my like selection of team at Google, I could potentially try to get to something that in that way find something more directly applying stuff that I felt like I was learning in class. So
like more robotic stuff?
Not necessarily robotics necessarily, but I don't even know. Just any like seeing if I could get anything even remotely close. Or, I mean, you could summarize all of this as like me trying to justify to myself not going into computer science in first year.
Right.
But yeah, so I ended up going back there because I had a return offer and because I was able to find a team that was like working in speech recognition and language modeling that was pretty interesting. And I did try to apply for some other stuff as well, but that was like the best thing that I had available to me at the time.
How different was it from your first summer at Google?
I would say quite different. So for one, I was working in Mountain View and not San Francisco, which is a whole thing of like, Mountain View is their headquarters. It's a town of roughly 100,000 people where practically half of them work at Google in the whole town. And I was living in Mountain View as well, like many of the other interns do, because
Google
it's a far
town
commute from everywhere else. Yeah, and it's completely like, feels like this weird utopian, dystopian, futuristic sort of thing, where like the bikes you see in the street are like whatever, green, red, yellow, and blue, Google colored, and like it was a lot. You see so many groups of interns forming, and like a lot of fun social stuff going on, but it's it all feels very, very temporary. Like you're there for the summer and then everyone disperses back to wherever they go to school.
Gotcha. And did the work feel significantly different?
The work felt pretty different. I think I did to some extent leave it feeling like there is a range of experiences that you can get at a single company, a large company especially. From the first team to the second, there are a number of differences I could point out, like the size of my team that I was working with / the size of like the peripheral teams that we were interacting with, where this team fits into like the overall organizational structure. It's like a bit more of a younger team in terms of the product, and also a lot more people from like academic backgrounds just by nature of the projects. A lot of like PhDs, more research type people. And those are all differences that like did lead to some differences in how it was working. But on the sort of day-to-day ground level, me sitting at my computer, a lot of it also still did feel the same. It's still the same, like writing code within Google's code base, and like stuff that I learned and got comfortable with in the first summer did apply to that second summer as well.
Gotcha. Are you glad you did the second summer there?
Yeah, I would say so. Also considering just I didn't really have too many other like super good options. Otherwise, I had applied for some things but didn't really get too many. So it was definitely the best thing I could have been doing.
Gotcha.
But I also, I think I also, that's unfair to, like, I did get a lot from that, and I do feel like by that end of that second summer, I felt a lot of confidence in my technical abilities in general.
Sweet. Well, we'll talk about the application of those technical abilities at Rapyuta, but we're going to take a quick break now. We'll be back with more Arkady.
Hello, it's me, Arkady. I just wanted to wish you all a happy new year, and also wanted to let you know that we have a live show coming up tomorrow. That's Tuesday, January 15th, and that'll be taking place in the Pit. Also, as always, be sure to subscribe to us on Spotify or iTunes, wherever you get your podcast, and like us on Facebook, Instagram, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any ideas, think you or somebody you know would be good to have on the show. And without further ado, let's get back to the show.
And we're back from an interlude with Arkady to more of an interview with Arkady. So you mentioned that you started to work from September onwards at a company called Rapyuta Robotics, and you mentioned that they do this cloud platform thing. Tell us a little bit more about Rapyuta, like where they are and like what you were doing with them.
Right. So Rapyuta, they had 3 offices at the time that I was working there. That was in Zurich, in Tokyo, and in Bangalore. Honestly, that was part of like the draw when I saw it on the PY portal. It was like looking at the list of all the things. There's like Markham, Mississauga, Brampton, Markham, Zurich, mark 'em.
Yeah.
So I saw that and I was like kind of drawn. And that wasn't the sole thing. Like if I had found a good thing in Markham, I probably would have done it too. Something that I was really trying to do. But that was so I was in Switzerland. The plan when I arrived there was for me to be in Switzerland kind of indefinitely, for the duration of my time there. But that didn't end up happening. Although the hope also was that I would potentially, like this was discussed when I was interviewing for them as well, that I would maybe get to like see the other offices too and see the other cities.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
So, what were you doing for Rapyuta?
Yeah, a few things. So, it's kind of it's kind of a cliche at this point, the way that people talk about working at a startup. They were maybe 30 people, about like 15 or so of those were software engineers working on the actual tech product, as opposed to corporate, CEO, business salespeople, etc. But so that's a very, very small team, and we were really mostly working on like it's kind of what they say is like everyone sort of works on everything and you work on what needs to be done. Mm-hmm. That's kind of how it got to feel by the end. It was like people were, once you get to know, it took me a while to get to know sort of the product that they were working on and what exactly their goal was and how exactly I could contribute to that. But I was in general working on like the platform and products that they wanted to release on that platform. Like a main project that I was working on was this interface for being able to control a drone from remotely and define like a plan for how it's going to move on a map and survey your farm or whatever you want surveyed. This is a common drone application, and then like take a bunch of pictures and like stitch them all together and mine some insights from that could be useful for a customer. That was sort of one of the main projects that I worked on at Rapyuta, and so yeah, that's kind of the bulk of what I worked on from a technical side.
Right. Did it feel significantly different or more robotics-y from your previous jobs?
At times a little bit. At least the people that I was working with, especially those in Zurich, were a lot of people with like robotics PhDs, and they were working on sort of control theory stuff. I feel like I didn't get to touch that as much as I wanted to. I got to work a little bit with a thing called ROS, Robotics Operating System, or Robot Operating System, I don't remember. Mm-hmm. That's really, really ubiquitous, and that was part of, like, right now, if you're trying to work in robotics, like, that is the number one thing that's, like, taken over in the last few years that everyone kind of needs to know, because it's just the main sort of software framework that any robotics applications are developed in.
Gotcha.
It may not stick around forever, but right now that's very, very widely used in the industry, so I wanted to get a taste of that. I did a little bit, but I would say it was a stretch of maybe 3 weeks that I was working on this one ROS-related thing, but the majority was not so much that. And the majority was stuff that felt like some sort of mix of the things that I had done the previous 3 summers. General, like, web development, software engineering tasks.
Mm-hmm. Did it feel like different doing it, first of all, in a startup, but second of all, doing it for a robotics company?
Unfortunately, I feel like not as much as I maybe was hoping for. Mm-hmm. To some extent, yes. Like, I think I did get to like talking to my coworkers who really also were like very passionate about this thing and knew a lot about robotics and like were thinking about it through that perspective. Like, we're thinking about this drone product with a lot of knowledge about how drones actually work. Like, there was that element of it, but it's really, the bulk of your time is really spent like just by yourself at your desk working on your own stuff, and that time was largely, I would say, similar to the software engineering, and that is how things tend to be. Like, that's what a lot of the actual work that needs to get done is, and yeah, that's inevitably the case. I found. Right.
Well, even if the work didn't feel that different, I'm sure living in Zurich was markedly different from living anywhere else. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. I definitely enjoyed it in Zurich a lot. It was a very, like, a lot of the things that I had heard about it going in turned out to be true, and such as just how crazy clean it is. Like, don't think I saw like a piece of garbage on the ground anywhere in like 4 months.
Wow.
How insanely on time the trains are. Like when a train says it's going to arrive at 12:07, it arrives between 12:06 and 45 seconds and 12:07 and 15 seconds. Like that. If a train is more than a minute late, it was like I saw that happen in 4 months when I was taking the train all the time, like once or twice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of like people get a little shook and like, yeah, that was pretty crazy. That was cool to see, just like on what level they could get their infrastructure to be that good. And it applies to a lot of things. Like there was one time, just the way that everything is very, very sharp. Like when you're at a place that's about to close, like I was at a museum one time and I was there at like 5:59 or something and it was closing at 6 or 5:55 maybe. And at some point people just sort of appear out of nowhere, like you didn't even see them before, and they just slowly start kind of like ushering you towards the exit. Like, no, stop looking at stuff in the museum store, like leave. Where at 6 o'clock our door is locked and everyone is out. Like that is, and it's sharp. And like I seem to be the only person who didn't firmly understand that. Where it's like here, if you're working at a clothes store that closes at 9 o'clock, you're working till 10, like 100%. Right. If there's a lineup at 9, they're settling up until 9:30, and then you clean up some more. Where there, it's like 6 o'clock it closes. 6 o'clock, everyone who works there is out the door.
Right, and everybody seems to just understand that.
Yeah.
Gotcha. How did you end up spending your time outside of work in Switzerland?
A few things. I did try to like explore a bunch. I like took the train out to nearby towns and stuff. Like I've been to like all of the cities in Switzerland bigger than 100,000 people, which is not many. Mm-hmm. But and just took the train out to like every different little place and saw a lot of like really really pretty places. Listened to a lot of podcasts, but a lot of it was like sort of alone time and having to get comfortable with that. Especially because I didn't really know anybody going in there, and my coworkers were largely like there was some just bit of like an age gap and different sort of like where we were at in our lives, and there wasn't really anybody around my age or like my sort of place in life, and so I found I had a little bit of a hard time socially getting with them. So that inevitably did lead to a lot of like alone time while I was there, which meant to just a lot of listening to podcasts, reading, other stuff. I had some friends there, but over a period of what ended up only being 4 months, it was kind of difficult to really form anything like substantial.
So speaking of, mm-hmm. you mentioned that it ended up being 4 months, but the original plan was for it to be 12.
That's right.
How did that happen?
Right. So at the end of December, the company sort of pretty suddenly announced that they were closing their office in Switzerland. Like I just remember it happening like one morning, and I was like, almost did the stereotypical like spit out my coffee or whatever if I drank coffee, and like it came as quite a surprise. I had the option to relocate to Bangalore in India. My whole office had this option to relocate to India or to Tokyo. And for me, the option was more in Bangalore because that was kind of where they wanted me, and that was where the people that I had been working with a little bit were mostly going to be. But I mean, most of the people in my office ended up leaving at that time.
Leaving the company.
Yeah, and I stayed because it was like, what am I going to do? I'm not going to find something in the next 2 weeks to do from January to whenever. And, I'm still enjoying it, and I wouldn't mind to go to India and so on. Like, mm-hmm. all of these things was like, it was it ended up being, right. Yeah, it was not actually a hard decision to make. The harder thing was like, just like rationalizing it to my parents and like, and just like making the actual preparations that I needed to go. But the actual decision whether I should go or not was like pretty quick. So I ended up from the start of January, like I went home for Christmas break and then, but like packed all my stuff from Switzerland and like went home, and then, which was convenient because I got to like dump all my winter clothes and then go to India where
winter's not as much of a thing.
Yeah, where winter was not as much of a thing, you could say, yeah. And from the start of January, I was already there working in Bangalore.
That's really cool. So I feel like this must have been quite different from the other work experiences you'd had, just because before you had been at like big, stable software companies, and here you are with a company that goes like, whoop, just closed an office. Like, what was that experience of just finding that out like?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it had never even like entered into my mind that a thing like that could happen or does happen. Like that offices close, that companies go through difficult times, but also still survive and can come out thriving. And like it really, when I first heard that was a possibility, like for someone with more experience, I think for most of the people in the office, they probably to a much greater extent felt like there were sort of signs in the air and they were not so blindsided by it. But I was quite like, whoa, okay, wow. And like, yeah, the office is just not going to exist. Okay. So it was definitely a surprise to myself more than I think it was to the others around me.
Right. How'd you feel about the work side of things?
So my work in India, it definitely felt like I had a lot more work to do in India. Like part of the reason why the office in Switzerland closed was because it was like there was just some little bit of like mismatch they felt between what the people in Zurich were working on and what their backgrounds were most qualified to do, which was like robotics applications and working directly with like drones and
as opposed to working on software.
Yeah, and so they felt like they didn't necessarily need all of those people who were like able in that area. So I guess there was a period for like the first 4 months I was kind of thinking like I feel a little bit underworked.
Sure.
There were stretches of like a couple weeks where I would be like just working on my like terminal skills and like my Git skills and just like learning a bit because I'm like I still am like obligated to be here in this time, but I literally don't have things to do. And that happens at work all the time. Like you have just like stretches where it's not always like as much as you want to be working. Sometimes there just isn't so much to do in the immediate moment. But in India, I didn't really have any periods like that. Like I was sort of a little closer to the product, and we were always like, there's stuff that we need worked on, and like I was there and ready to do it. Or in Switzerland, that felt less the case.
Gotcha. What was the like culture shift like, or just like the work outside of work life change like moving from Zurich to Bangalore?
Yeah, I think it's hard to. I'm like a little hesitant to extrapolate too much about Zurich as a whole or Bangalore as a whole.
What was it like for you?
But in my experience, which was heavily shaped by like, you know, my immediate coworkers, the like 5 or so people immediately around me in my office of maybe 10, 15 or so in India, it was a lot more social. It was a lot more like we would just like hang out at the office on a Friday night and like watch a movie or something and like felt and go out for dinner and just like hang out a lot more in a way that felt like as friends. Not even necessarily that there was a big difference in ages. I think the people were also similarly mostly older than me in the office in India, but somehow it just like ended up working out differently, that with that group of people I was a little bit more like socially integrated with them, and that ended up being a lot of fun. Like I got to, I think if it had been like Switzerland, I don't think I would have explored nearly as much as I did in India, just because I definitely did need a lot of help in general at first, just getting around in terms of like, how do you, like, what public transit options are available and if I should take them or not. And, you know, how do I, like, how much am I expected to negotiate my price of a taxi ride, and like all of these things,
all these social customs.
Yeah, and just like what even is worth doing? Like, should I be like, what are good places to eat? All these stuff. Like, what are good things to order? Like my coworkers seem to enjoy sort of showing me around in that way, and I definitely feel like I got to see a lot more than I would have ever gotten to see as a tourist. Like I felt like that I got to experience the place while working there ended up being much more better as a tourist experience too than if I had been there just as a tourist.
What do you think was like your like favorite thing you got to like experience or learn in your 4 months there?
I could name a few things. A lot of them revolve around like food, to be honest. Like one thing I really, really miss is just the corner stands with like tea shops, or like on the corner directly outside of my workplace there was a tea shop where like just some guy had for like 10 cents just like small cups of tea that my coworkers, we would go out for tea breaks like 2-3 times a day and just like hang out there. And directly next to there was another dude with, it was, you could call it a coconut stand, I guess, but it was really like, it was a dude with like 100 coconuts and a machete.
Right.
And like he would just, lop the top off, and you could just do that. And another thing like up the street was, this one specifically I really, really miss, which is like sugarcane juice. You've probably never had that before.
I have not.
But it's like, oh, it was incredible. It was those things, like just little things that are just like there around. From a consumption perspective, like that was really good. That sounds a little bit like gluttonous for me to be reminiscing about.
No, but that's cool, and that was like a core part of your day to day.
Yeah, it was. Especially just that like I was able to just eat out a lot more because it tends to be cheaper. So I lived with a lot more comforts than I feel like I did in Switzerland, where I was like quite tight, because everything in Switzerland is super, super expensive. So I definitely got to like do a lot of that stuff. I think another big highlight was this trip that we made to the state called Goa, which was like directly adjacent to the state that I was in, Karnataka. I went there with like 3 or 4 of my coworkers and like a couple of their friends, and we just stayed in a hostel for 2 nights, I think. It's like one of the cheapest vacations I've ever done still, and we just sort of like rented motorcycles and just like went around these like beaches, really, really nice places, like from beach to like night market, and just like walked around, ate a lot, like sat, drank, slept, and it was really nice. That was like one of the most enjoyable weekends. Unfortunately, because I was only there for a short amount of time and there were not too many like long weekends or anything, I didn't get to kind of travel as much around the country as I would have liked to, because especially hearing from my coworkers who were often like, some person would just be gone for a few days because they would have to go to some wedding or something, often a wedding, in like a different state, and they would go there for a few days, and they would show me pictures, and it would seem super cool, or they would just go to some nearby state to like visit friends. I feel like we don't really have that in Canada so much, where like, the next closest city here where I like know anybody is 6 hours away.
Right.
And the one after that is another like 4 hours. And after that, God knows, like,
yeah.
You don't really feel like this direct, like intimate connection with the country as much as I feel like people there do. Where like because there are a lot of people everywhere, there are places within a 1 hour flight range or like or overnight bus range where like, and more than just 2 of them, where you could go and like really see stuff. And so I found that people there did a lot more of that, at least my coworkers.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
So it sounds like you had a good 4 months there, but it did only end up being 4 months instead of what was the expected 8.
Right.
So how did that happen?
Yeah, it was a kind of complicated thing, I think. So I ended up at the end of April leaving Rapyuta. They wanted to like change the terms of my contract a little bit to change my salary when I moved to India. And I had sort of stood firm, and so I was technically fired with like a 3-month notice at the end of January. And then at the end of April was when that ended, and at that time but it was not necessarily the formality of it. It was more, at that point I also was like feeling like I had gotten the most from my experience there, and the like benefit of being able to do an additional summer was higher. Like that if I could, the fact that I was able to do so, where I originally had wanted to do something along those lines, like 4 months, and that wasn't really like allowed within the parameters of PUI, and that I sort of got an excuse to do so, because I was technically fired. Like I was like, great, I can, I can find another thing for the summer, and I have 3 months to look for it. I was pretty happy with it. I think I definitely would have enjoyed more time as well to like hang out in India. But ultimately, like getting an additional 4 months working in another entirely different place was nice. And I was also by that point kind of weary and like wanted to go home or like somewhere closer to home, because it was, I haven't talked about this at all, but like there's like a 10.5 hour time difference in India, between 9.5 and 10.5, because I think there was some daylight savings time shenanigans while I was there. But like that basically meant I could maybe have a brief call with my family in the morning as they were just about to go to sleep, or like exchange a few messages. But it was really like to a much, much greater extent than when I was in Europe. Like I was there kind of on my own with what is immediately physically surrounding me, because at that point it felt like a pretty insurmountable sort of time difference. Like I could exchange a few messages, but I didn't really feel super, super connected to people back home at that time. And I was kind of missing that.
Gotcha. So you ended up moving closer to home. Where was that and what were you doing there?
Yeah, so I found a summer internship at Shopify, which is an e-commerce company based in Ottawa, with offices also in Toronto, Montreal, Waterloo. And so I had heard about this company a little bit. I actually, I'd been to their Toronto office before for some like tech talks in first year, and on the like Canadian tech radar, they're pretty big. In the bigger picture, they're also still pretty big. But yeah, so it was really getting an opportunity to be in Canada, which was nice, because I was like thinking, I've been on all these internships. I've spent like 6 different 4-month periods at this point, and they're all, the closest one to Toronto was in Vancouver, and I wanted to get some little bit of more taste of like what life could be like if I were working in Toronto area, or what ended up being Ottawa, which was like sort of close to Toronto. I was able to at least make like 4 or 5 weekend trips back home and stuff.
Nice.
Yeah, so I worked in Ottawa for the remaining 4 months on like their data platform, in general, providing like analytics to people who use Shopify to make an online store. And that was another, like, in terms of the actual technical work, I would like sort of shift from what I had been doing up to that point, and just like more valuable industry experience, I felt.
That's cool. Did you like the company?
Yeah, I did a lot. It did feel in a lot of ways like, I mean, at this point, a lot of like tech corporate cultures are based off of, it feel a lot like Google, like echoing them, with all of just like the intern events and like sort of lavish offices and like over the top modern furniture and like
snacks, swag, nap rooms,
all of those things. Yeah. And all of that, I was like, nice. Okay. I'm like, yeah, I've done this before. I can't say I don't like it. And all of those aspects, like I was, it didn't feel like they were slacking on any of that. And, that was all enjoyable, but also the actual company and like what they work on and the like level of quality of technical people there and so on. Like I did feel like I was able to learn from the people there, and I came out of those 4 months like with more respect for the company overall.
Cool. What was working in Ottawa like? You mentioned you got to go home a bunch, but what was Ottawa like?
It was interesting. I mean, I'd been to Ottawa a little bit before, like for 1 or 2 just like random weekend trips, but I never, because it happened so suddenly, I wasn't really deeply like, I have a pick of all cities in the world. Where should I go? I'll choose Ottawa. It was more like, this is one of the possible things, one of a small handful of possible things I'm going to be able to find between January and April. And this has worked out, and it's like close enough at this point. And,
gotcha.
That, not to say though, honestly, Ottawa was a lot of fun. I think us from Toronto, we probably don't give it enough thought.
We roast it.
Yeah, we do, and we call it whatever, like a boring place. And there are like those sides of it, but I think, I don't know, I was able to have a very good time there over 4 months as well. There's plenty of stuff to do, and I think for a city of its size, it's probably more fun than average, just because it has all of the like touristy stuff in general that like.
And government is hype.
Yeah. I can't tell if that was sarcastic or not, but
quite.
but I mean, I don't know. It like I was there for Canada Day, which is actually pretty cool.
That's awesome.
Like, yeah, it was like a whole big, massive parade of people walking through the streets, and like actually watched it. I watched the fireworks that were taking place from Gatineau, which is like Ottawa sits right on the border with Quebec, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this town on the other side, where it felt like a whole different world, because they barely celebrate Canada Day there. But it's also the best place to watch the fireworks that are taking place in Ottawa.
Interesting.
So it was really nice. There was like a big crowd of people watching fireworks there. And in general, like there were a lot of nice places, and I think also my sort of situation was that I was living in a shared like student residence condo thing that Shopify had for the summer, like rented out a few dozen or so units for all of the other interns. So like that also provided like a lot more fun, just because I was living like directly next to other people in a similar sort of position that I could hang out with that also like were looking for things to do. So I think in that way it also felt very similar to like the previous Google internships and stuff, where it's like everyone around me is like looking to do some fun stuff, and they're all in like similar kind of positions.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, sounds like it was a great time. You get back to Toronto for September, and you start fourth year. Did fourth year feel like different from third year, and do you think PY had anything to do with that?
Yeah, I think yes to both questions. So fourth year, I mean, at this point, you know, I was at like one big way is for a lot of PY, I was thinking about should I do grad school or not, whether or not that would be, you know, valuable. And a lot of fourth year is spent thinking about what you're going to do in fifth year and beyond. And for a lot of people I know, that came down to a question of, do I want to apply for jobs or do I want to go to grad school? That's kind of where most people fall in between those two options, at least among people in like my circle of engineering students. And so I was also kind of like trying to decide on that question. I was using PUI as a way to kind of think about it as well. And so a lot of first semester of fourth year was spent thinking about that question, and also like applying for jobs and stuff. But also just from like a school perspective, I'm really at this point very much like I'm in my classes to like enjoy what I can learn from them.
Right.
I unfortunately I have a little bit of like leverage to be able to steer the classes that I want to take in terms of my electives and stuff. And I see a little bit from the PUI work that I've done. Like I've taken some courses based on that. For instance, I felt like if I want to kind of round out things that I might have missed out on if I had been in computer science, I am taking operating systems to that effect. This semester, I think the way that I spend my time is a little different as well. I'm focusing more on like how can I just enjoy this like time in Toronto more, and like get, you know, grow deeper connections with my classmates and friends here and stuff like that, more so than what is the like how can I grind to the best possible mark in robotics class X number 50. Like I think that's kind of feels like my academics are a little bit less of a priority at this point, which I'm pretty okay with. I would be surprised at, like, my first year self would be very surprised at me for this, but I feel like I know what I need in terms of like to succeed in the work that I'm kind of trying to do, and it doesn't directly correlate to like the classes that I'm in. It's a lot of also, and I found also what has led me to some success in like internships and stuff before has been a lot of all the stuff I've done outside of class and all of the like all of the side work, and I'm also trying to kind of cultivate some of that too.
Right. It sounds like you've kind of let go a little bit of this idea that like deep academics and like really, really pushing yourself on that is the way to be able to do the kind of work you want to do.
Yeah, I think that's the one of the big, I would say, takeaways that PUI kind of cemented in my head was exactly what you just said. That there are other things besides your like, you know, classroom learnings that are important to how you can succeed in a workplace, and that's eventually where I'm trying to end up. So how do I focus on those things more? And for me, that meant focusing more on like what people call soft skills, or like just more kind of growing myself as a person, growing myself in terms of how do I work on projects and work on within groups of people and stuff. But I think a lot of that comes from outside of the classroom.
That makes sense. So, speaking of moving into the future, like, where do you find yourself after fourth year?
Mm-hmm. So, I guess the final decision that I came to on that question, I kind of at the start of September was like, I'll apply for both grad schools and jobs, and I kind of first semester just sort of like came and went, and I didn't really have it in me to really do that. I was like starting on looking at some of the grad school programs, and I just didn't feel like it was what I needed right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so also it's quite hard to do that, actually, apply for both at the same time.
It's a lot.
Each of them individually is a lot. Each of them individually is enough to, if you're already kind of like close to your ceiling with school and extracurriculars and whatever, like that's already to push you all the way to your ceiling of how much time you have. And I really just didn't have more time to be doing one or the other, because if you're looking full time so what I ended up focusing more on was looking for full-time work. And I was like, if you're really doing it seriously, like I was trying to interview with like 3 to 5 companies all around the same time, and like getting them to align on the same sort of time schedule and deciding among them which I want to choose and so on. Like all of those took a lot of time, and that was like a big focus for me in first semester this year. And I don't think that I could have really at the same time applied for grad schools, but in the end I ended up applying to and getting an offer and accepting from this company called Didi, which is a Chinese company based in Beijing. I'll be working in Los Angeles though. They're a company that's in quotes like the Uber of China, but in general, I found a position in Los Angeles working on like natural language processing, some stuff that feels, I don't know. I don't know if I feel like at this point in the context of this conversation, have I gotten what I want in terms of, is it applying what I've learned in school to some extent, but
at this point it's just interesting.
Yeah, it's also just interesting, and I think that's perfectly valid reason to want to work somewhere as well. So that's kind of what I ended up choosing, but it was deciding between that and Google and Shopify and other sort of like software companies that I had been thinking about before that point too.
Cool. And what made this your choice?
A few things. I mean, like enough to fill a whole other podcast, but sure. I think part of it was, relating to PY. I think I wanted to. I really enjoyed the experience of working at a like international company and working where that wasn't US based. I liked working at Google too, but I felt like when I was in India, it felt like there was this whole other world that I didn't really think about much, which is like all of Asia and all of Europe and all of like the rest of the world that I think is increasingly, prominent and on the surface of and reaches us here in North America. But I think that's kind of was part of it, that I wanted to be more in touch with that, and to that end. But that was part of that was a big part of the thinking, and I think a lot of that actually was can be traced back to like my time in India and in Switzerland.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So I have 2 more questions for you. So the first is, if you were to look back over PY, what would you change?
Mm-hmm. I think probably the biggest one, in terms of the time that I sort of like feel was that I maybe most could have spent better, was I guess in the first few months at Rapyuta. What I ended up dragging on for like longer than necessary was like this period where I was just sort of like floundering and like waiting for some work to be given to me, or like waiting for I think at that time, which is probably around October, November, in those periods what I mentioned, that I was like spending a couple weeks working on just like practicing Git and whatever. I think in that time I could have been a little bit more proactive and reached out. The mistake I made was that my immediate sort of like one contact, my kind of quote unquote manager that I was in contact with, he was the main person that I talked to, and he was pretty much the only person that I talked to at that time. And I think if I were going about it now, I would probably be making a more aggressive effort to like talk to other people around the company, because what ended up happening, like I ended up after I left Switzerland working with a whole different group of people. I could have been already sort of more in with that and just like trying to sort of drill my way closer to like the center of the company and where I can talk to more people and get a better picture of what is going on at the whole company, where I was really just in contact with this one person, and like, he had his own stuff going on. He was also trying to figure out like what can we do as an office, and didn't really have as much time for directly thinking about like what work can I assign this person, how can I make them happy, how can I satisfy their goals of wanting to apply their schoolwork and whatever else he wants to do.
Like that felt like the kind of thing that you shouldn't have been waiting for, but should have been more aggressively pursuing.
I think so. And kind of if it didn't pan out by going this one route, try others.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So the other question that I think might be interesting specifically for our listeners is about the podcast itself.
Mm-hmm.
So from my end of things, August 25th of 2018, I get a message from you that says, hey, want to do a podcast about PY?
Mm-hmm.
And I had never done a podcast or really any like media meant for release.
Right.
But I said yes because it sounded really cool. And specifically for me, it was about hearing it was about like showing the stories of the people who are around us, and also about making something that could be genuinely useful for people who we go to school with. But I guess I'm curious, how did that idea like come to you, and like what were you expecting going in?
Mm-hmm. So, well, around August, I think everyone who's on PY like experiences this around August as you start coming back, especially as people are like abroad and all. You start like digging up your old group chats and messages and stuff, and like asking your friends from school, hey, how was your PY? What did you get up to, etc. And you just like start getting back in touch with the people that like I now spend most of my time with in fourth year, and I don't know, maybe other people have different experiences as they come back from PY, but for me it felt like every conversation I was having was like, wow, there's so much this person has to say about this. I want to write all of it down. I want to somehow get all of it down for someone to hear it, because like all of this, like these are all things that like I spent a lot of 16 months like thinking about all these questions that a lot of other people are also thinking about, and there are also a whole set of other questions that they're thinking about that are also interesting. And I felt like everyone just comes back from PY with all these epiphanies, and I wanted to try to capture that. That was kind of the motivation, and I think that's what we're trying to go for here.
So do you think that what we're doing right now kind of aligns decently closely with what you originally had in mind?
Yeah, I would say so. I think I'm surprised and like consistently amazed at just like how one of the big themes has just been like how much wider the range of PY experiences is than like my own. Mm-hmm. Every person we've talked to has had pretty different things going on, and it's like while main focus on my mind for all these 16 months was like my traveling and all of these thoughts I'm having about small versus large companies, grad school, and so on. Other people spent a whole 16 months, that same amount of time and attention, thinking about an entirely different range of things. How do I, if I spend the whole 16 months in Toronto, how do I get the most out of this time and deepen my connection with this city, which may or may not be home to me? And all of those different stories are interesting. I mean, it's like a year of a person's life, and they have a lot to say about it. So that's what I've been constantly kind of amazed by.
I mean, I think the cool thing is, like, as you said, like that there really isn't that big a common thread. Like, mm-hmm. if anything, it was good and I grew.
Yeah.
Like that's about it. And after that, I mean, every conversation has not been at all pigeonholable. right? I mean, I think the only other consistent thing is how'd you apply through the portal.
Right.
Even there, a ton of people have different stories, but that might be the only consistent thread. After that, people have all kinds of different experiences. Anyway, been fun so far?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. I think so too. Anyway, we're running a little bit over time here, so we're going to wrap it up. Thank you for talking. Thank you for stepping behind the mic, even as you are always on the other side of it. I don't know what the other side of the mic is. I feel like, I guess, thank you for stepping in front of the mic, which is also behind the mic. Thank you for stepping in front of the mic, along with the work that you do behind, in, and around, sometimes below the mic. This has been That Thing I Did for a Year. We'll see you next week.